Welcome to the Agile On The Mind podcast, where we discuss how to build intelligent teams inspired by agility in the world of cognitive science. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance you'll enjoy the Agile On The Mind Substack. To receive a free weekly newsletter with explorations of agility and cognitive science, complete with tools, tips and tricks, go to agileonthemind.substack.com. This week's guest is Michael Lloyd. Michael is a Scrum Master and an Agile coach who's been helping teams deliver value for over a decade. Michael is the founder and head of global agility at Honest Agile and the creator of Dysfunction Mapping. I've followed Michael on LinkedIn for a few years, and I've admired his thoughtful approach to working with teams and organizations. We met at a conference a few months ago and decided to publish a conversation together for Agile On The Mind. We decided to just see where we ended up, and as you'll see in the episode, we landed in some pretty interesting and wacky places, including from the initial introduction. I had a blast recording this with Michael, and I hope you enjoy listening to it. Here is my conversation with Michael Lloyd. Hi, Michael.
Hey, how's it going?
Do you prefer Michael or Mike?
Either is fine. Honestly, that's one of those weird things that I've never understood. People that have a strong preference, you can call me whatever you like. Yeah, it's interesting when you introduce as Michael, if someone you use a different version of your name. Like, it's not that I particularly care. The way I've always framed it is, it's like, it's just a noise that people make to get your attention. I don't particularly care what noise you make as long as I know that it's directed at me. But there is something interesting, isn't there, about when you know, if you introduce yourself as Michael and someone immediately shortens it to Mike. It could be that they just feel like they're close to you and that's okay. But it might just be that they're not really listening to you, or, you know, there's a lot that could be hidden there.
There's interesting like Jewish mystical stuff about like your name having really deep significance, and you know, your ideas about choosing a name very carefully because it represents what this person will be like, and people can take with
it feels like star signs to me. Not to disrespect anyone else's beliefs, but it's not what I buy into. It's just a noise.
I guess there's a friend of mine shared this perspective with me when it comes to stuff like star signs, of which, like, I agree this is in that category, which is if you're brought up with that stuff being made very apparent to you, then there may be some like self-fulfilling element to it, in which case like your star sign or your irrational thing that you carry around actually can be quite informative for you. So if I grew up with people saying, and this didn't happen, but if it did, with them saying, "Oh, Daniel, that means like God is my judge, so you need to be really careful because, you know, this you're being watched, or, you know, you need to like act well." And to some degree, like, I guess I have carried that in some ways. Then the fact that I'm called Daniel is representative of who I am or who I've become.
Yeah. No, there's a big element there of kind of self-fulfillment, right? In the way that, you know, if you believe something, it has an effect on you, so it doesn't necessarily matter if it's true, because it's affected you in some way. I had an interesting chat with someone about this on Myers-Briggs of all things recently, because I love to use the Myers-Briggs test as like team building exercises. And I don't know if for anyone's not familiar with it, right? It's just like a personality test. You answer questions and it categorizes you into these different personality tests. And when I tell people that I often use it for team building activities, some people will say things like, "Oh, it's basically just horoscopes. It's meaningless. It scientifically doesn't matter. So, you know, you shouldn't do it." It's like, right, but I could use horoscopes for team building as well, right? It's not about whether it's true or whether it's scientifically accurate. It's about getting people to go through that thought process of putting themselves in these categories and talking to each other about what categories they're in and what, you know, which parts they identify with and which parts they don't. That's a useful bonding exercise. And you could do that on all sorts of made up things, but the Myers-Briggs just happens to touch on, you know, the personality elements that are relevant to teams doing stuff. And so it's useful in that way.
That are interesting to them, and that they say, actually, yeah, like my introversion, extroversion is a thing that I think about sometimes. And it might be that like you catch me on a particularly introverted day and I come out more I, or something like that. Or in a situation, I'm more E, and more extrovert. But that still can facilitate a really interesting conversation where people share stuff with each other and bond. And like, the point isn't whether the tool is like true or not. The point is whether you can build a relationship with it, or whether you can learn something about the others. And like, Leanne Meller, who was the head of delivery at Ministry of Justice, uses tarot with her teams, which I love, because that's like the most, it like irrational in a good way. Like it's clearly just like symbols and metaphors and archetypes and stuff like that. And then people get to go like, yeah, that resonates with me because, and then the because is interesting. Similar with like the blob tree or something, where you ask people, which of these blobby people dangling off a tree do you feel like today? Yeah, I was definitely one of the people that would have criticized your use of Myers-Briggs for not being scientific enough in the past, and now would be like, it's cool, it doesn't matter. Like,
yeah, no, I think it's interesting because that's the same, I guess, pragmatic mindset that I try to have, right? And I think I've gone through the same journey in that I would have been super critical of stuff like that because my default is that I am a very like analytical, fact-based, evidence-based person. But I've come to realize by being empathetic, by having conversations and understanding why other people have these other views, is that, yeah, a huge part of that, what I would term unscientific stuff, still has immense value to people, and it still can have immense explanatory power, and it can still, really help people to make decisions. And that's all that actually matters in the end, right? And in fact, my view is that it's better when you have a group of people that have different ways of thinking about those things, because any one of them is probably wrong on a number of things. So when you bring them together, they'll kind of find the truth, right? Which is why it's really dangerous to kind of treat any of this stuff as just, oh no, that's wrong or stupid. It's like there's always some truth there. You just have to look for it.
And it's a really important like faculty of reasoning that it's a very important type of reasoning. I think it's an example of abductive reasoning. And last podcast was with Dave Snowden, where we went through inductive, deductive, and abductive. So I'm going to see if I could use this episode as a little bit of revision for me. That we imagine that like the clever, logical, scientific type stuff is a kind of reasoning, right? So we're used to inductive reasoning, which is every time X has happened, Y has happened. So therefore X, so therefore Y, right? Like every time I talk to Michael Lloyd, we get distracted and go in a million directions. Today I'm talking to Michael Lloyd, and therefore, like, I just guess because of past experience, we're going to go in a million interesting directions, and we'll get lost. And there's like deductive reasoning, which is if A then B, A therefore B, right? So if Michael is an agile coach, all agile coaches come on my podcast, therefore Michael will come on my podcast, and that kind of logic. But we don't really use that in our day to day. We use this third type, which is heuristics and statistics and metaphor and like gathering meaning from all these other places, and that's called abductive reasoning. And stuff like star signs and tarot and symbolic representations of stuff is way more aligned to 99% of our reasoning than the more formal stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because I think this leans to a lot of what happens in the agile world with our like infighting of like frameworks and philosophies and all the other things, is that we have this tendency to take that heuristic thinking, which no doubt has a lot of truth and is based on a lot of good experience that we should consider, but we then apply it in this really broad sense and assume that every other situation and every other person essentially should therefore draw the same conclusions that we draw, and that leads to all this infighting that we have.
Yeah, there's a kind of denial of or an awareness of reality there, right? Because I assume that if using framework blah with this team worked with the team, and therefore if I'm in a different team I can use the same framework, or it didn't work and therefore it wouldn't work, or anything like that, and I try and assume that case A is like case B, then I'm making a claim about reality, which is that there's enough similarity between that one and this one that it's worth doing that. And that's a big, not necessarily a given.
It's interesting as well, 'cause you mentioned that you were speaking to Dave Snowden on the last podcast, and I think he obviously has done a lot of really interesting work on this topic. But one of the things that I find super fascinating is how easily we want to jump to, what would you call it, the kind of logical reductionism of, well, this is true in theory, this is true in this context, therefore we should take it as generally true. Whereas the kind of the overwhelming point of the agile movement and where it came from was the realization that we're actually in this more complex domain and things don't have simple one-to-one connections. And we all kind of know and acknowledge and agree with that. And yet, even in our movement where we're supposedly the experts in this, we fall back to this very, say, just reductive view of, okay, well then this framework good, this framework bad, this philosophy good, this philosophy bad, and I think it's just it's human nature. We know it's human nature, but I guess the question is, well, if the people who are supposedly the ones who are meant to be teaching us the better way are themselves falling victim to it, what hope do we have? It's maybe a bit cynical, but
yeah, well, it's like the Agile Manifesto or Scrum Guide put in, and this might map to something called, that we think of as an agile mindset, or I don't know. But an agile mindset is like, this is the problem of doing too much research on Dave Slocum, is that I have his critiques of words like that ringing in my ears when I say things like that. There is no such thing as a mindset. Mental models is a disproven concept, but whatever. The thing that we know underpins the implementation of the agile principles we might refer to as a mindset, or as something where you acknowledge the complex, entangled, embodied, embedded ways that we make sense in the world, and that is the starting point, and you can't move past that. And any oversimplification will miss something really important.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that the way that Dave talks about mindset is actually a really good example of one of those places where I find myself just wanting to look for truth in both ends, because I think Dave is right, and the way that he talks about our overuse of that term mindset and the way we speak about it like it's just some kind of model that can be lifted and shifted or even directly influenced is obviously nonsense, right? Like, we know that humans and minds are not that simple.
Don't change the system, change the mindsets of the people around you. Like, that is kind of chaotic way of being.
Yeah, as if that's easy, right? As if, well, if you couldn't change a system and some processes, then just change 1,000 people's brains. That'll be easy, right? So we obviously know that that's the case, but I think the element of truth that I wouldn't say Dave misses, because I know he considers this, but the way that people often interpret or simplify what he talks about is that therefore there's no value in considering this concept of how we think about and internalize our values or our principles and how that affects our action, right? And I think that is still something that we should be thinking about, which is to say, if you want to convince someone to change their behavior because we believe that their behavior is, not adding value or is a detriment in some way, one of the best ways you can do that is to try and connect with them emotionally and understand the emotional things that they're thinking about. That's still ultimately a mindset thing. It's not this simplified idea of, oh, well, just give per person a manifesto with a different set of principles in it and change their mindset. It's about understanding that, like you say, we're a collection of different thoughts, and you can't necessarily expect to just change it. But if you are thinking about, how your words are heard and how, your empathy with how people are feeling, it is possible to kind of meet people in the middle as long as you're willing to change too. And that's where kind of mindset change can come in.
The way I think about mindset in that regard is I try and the way I want to think about mindset in this regard, and I don't know if I do, I'll see myself at work and see if I'm doing this, is to only think of changing that mindset stuff in myself. So that the only person who's like mindset or whose understanding of reality kind of matters is the person who's trying to make the interventions, which in this case is me. So it means that when I have a choice to go and like try and change a person's behavior, or I can try and change the system because of the entangled complex nature, it's much easier to change the system than it is to change the individuals, or it's much more effective or more ethical, in Dave's words, then that's the only person whose mindset has been changed there is mine. But that's an important one, because it means that then I'll act differently in that system, and maybe try and bring other people on board and say, it's not about trying to get you to change this behavior to that behavior. It's more about working out how can we change the system, the interactions, the entanglements, the connections between people, such that the behavior will just dissolve away, probably.
Again, I hate to be one of those it depends types, but I do think that there's an element there's an element on both sides of it, right? Which is to say, you can change the system and people's behavior can naturally change. But I'm sure most of us have experienced other people, and possibly been ourselves, a person whose behavior has become so deeply entrenched by the patterns and incentives and other things that even if the system were to change, we would actually find it very, very difficult to change our behavior, right? And so let's just use cynicism as an example, right? If you have worked for 20 years in a system that has done everything it can to try to destroy your creativity and prevent you from being successful and prevent you from collaborating with people, and you have developed an extreme cynical mindset, let's say, again, I know it's a simplification, but if cynicism has become your default approach, then even if that system were to be magically fixed overnight, there are some people that are not going to then just, not only not immediately, but perhaps never get past that cynicism without some other kind of intervention, right? Which would, in my view, be that kind of emotional or empathetic intervention, which is to say, sometimes you need a person-to-person relationship where someone says, hey, this is what I'm observing, or this is how this is making me feel. And even to use the actual route of intervention, right? In terms of, we talk about having interventions for people who are engaged in dangerous behavior, or let's say alcoholics. So one of the first things that you do in those scenarios is you connect with people and try to help them understand how their actions are negatively impacting you. And sometimes that's the only way to make things change, and that's not a systemic change, that's an emotional change. So I think there are two things, and both have to be considered in some cases.
Yeah, I think we're thinking about, like, maybe it's the difference between what do I do at scale to 1,000 people versus what can I do as an individual within my team. And I know that, like, I personally have had good feedback in the past that stopped me being so much of a dick, and that's been useful to me and to the team around me, and that's been a useful thing to have fed back to me. So if we go in hard with mindsets shouldn't be something that we try to change, or we don't try and only change the environment, I think that wouldn't have been as effective as telling me, like, Daniel, in those meetings, can you shut up, or can you credit the other people that helped you, rather than just saying I'm like, oh yeah, I do that. Oh, great, thank you. Whereas if I'm thinking at organizational scale, what do I do as the CEO or the CEO or whatever, then trying to change individual mindsets towards, everyone's going to become a growth mindset person now, so we're all going to go on a course. That's weird. And then the affordances, the options that you have in the system are at those interaction levels, and try to change the rules or change other bits, and don't try and change everyone's mindset one at a time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that comes to my point about empathy, right? So I think that's the piece that is important to me, is you can't have empathy for 1,000 people that you don't know all at once, right? You can have empathy for individuals in direct conversations. You can have a kind of empathy, or a kind of understanding for people's mindsets potentially, but what you're not going to get is a true understanding of what motivates this person when you've got 1,000 people, because it's going to be too different. People are not all the same. But I think that's kind of where I'm going with that need to consider both. Is like, for example, if you are a CEO and you're trying to affect an organization of 1,000 people, yes, you should probably be primarily focusing on the systemic process, architecture, let's say, of your organization as your key area of focus. But if you're not also taking time to consider at least some of that one-to-one empathy connection and one-to-one relationship building, and again, for want of a better word, one-to-one mindset consideration, then I don't think the process thing is going to be successful either, because how can you think about architecture, process, the big picture of an organization without having some connection to the individuals that make up that system? And so again, it just, for me, becomes, you have to have both.
Mm. And my understanding, you've come up with this tool, Dysfunction Mapping. My understanding is that Dysfunction Mapping tries to bridge some of those chasms and tries to be able to operate at both that system level and that personal level. Can you maybe say a bit about whether that's true or not, and how that works?
Yeah, I think so. So Dysfunction Mapping came from my background as an Agile coach and a Scrum Master, and essentially all of the mistakes that I made that I've kind of now built a process to prevent me from making those mistakes again. And the two key things that it tries to do that I think capture some of what we just talked about is, you start the approach, you start this idea of, okay, I'm going to find and solve some problems by talking to the people in your organization, the people in your team, your stakeholders, whoever it is that's around you, and trying to empathize with them and get in their heads of what is it that that you need solved, right? What are the problems that you care about? What makes you dread coming into work on a Monday? And like really just trying to anchor yourself to that worldview, because I certainly, like a lot of people, have made the mistake in the past of just trying to like implement a framework and, you know, change a process and think everything's going to get better. But if you're not actually solving the problems that people care about, then of course that's not, you know, they're not going to go along with it. Even if they do, it's not going to have the right impact. But then I guess the second part that connects to this is there's a step in dysfunction mapping. We don't need to talk about all of it, but there's a step called purpose, which is where you're hypothesizing an action that you can take, something that you might do to solve some of those problems, and you deliberately take some time to really understand, right, what's the value or the principle we're trying to get to here? Like, what is it we're trying to achieve and why? To make sure that we're all actually united around this value or this whatever it is. So we're not just following a rule for the rule's sake, and we're not just doing what the boss says. It's, yeah, we actually care about doing something different. And I guess when you've done those two things and you use the rest of this process, the goal is come up with a small action that you can take that helps move us in the right direction, and then measure for change, see what happens, and then hopefully things get a little bit better, and you can do that incrementally, step by step, which I think, again, is the piece that's often missing in our world, right? A lot of people try to change everything all at once, and actually it turns out it's a terrible way to change complex systems. So small changes kind of where we start from.
Yeah, next best thing type thinking. And that's the thing we do intuitively well as individuals. As a human, I know that if I'm driving to Scotland, I'm based in London, I can set the destination maybe, or I can set the direction I want to go in, but I can't know what's going to happen along the way. So I'll take one step at a time. I'll get in my car, I'll go, maybe that's a bad example, because in that case I'm going to Scotland and I know where Scotland is. Whereas when it comes to organizations, we don't know where Scotland is, metaphorically.
I think the thing that's interesting to me is like the idea of, well, okay, you're going to plan a trip to Scotland. What you're not going to do is plan all of your toilet stops along the way, right? You're going to figure out where the toilets are along the route, and you know, you're not going to plan exactly when you're going to stop for lunch and what you're going to have for lunch. You're going to figure that out as you go. And there is always the possibility that on any of those stops, something that could happen would change your destination, right? You might see a news update or get a phone call from someone, or get a bit ill and decide that you don't want to go to Scotland, and you allow that plan to change. You wouldn't just say, no, I plan to go to Scotland, I'm going to keep going. Like, I think that's, even in that, we can be very adaptable.
And you definitely don't plan every wheel turn and every gear change. I was just thinking, like in examples like this, you often learn a lot about the way that the person that you're using the example with thinks. So like, right. I'm pretty sure there are people that are like, we are going to go to that service station and we'll stop off there for lunch and that kind of thing. But that's not my style at all. It's like, I will drive until I'm hungry and then I will think about it then. We'll work it out.
Right.
I was talking to Vitaly Sharovatov on one of my first podcasts, and he was talking about developers having laptop stickers. And he said, if I'm an introvert and I'm at the airport and I see someone else with laptop stickers, I'm going to want to go and talk to them rather than go and talk to someone without the laptop stickers. And I was like, I think you're an extrovert, and your assumption is that introverts want to talk to other introverts. And I don't know how true that was.
The thing that flashed in my brain as you said that is, I look at people that put stickers on their laptops, and it puzzles me, because I treat my laptop like my baby, and it has to be in pristine condition, and I don't put anything on it. And so when you see these people that have got stickers just blasted all over the laptop, it's just one of those, it's culture shock. I just don't get it.
What do you think is going on there? Maybe we should have a debate. We should bring on a sticker laptop person and a pristine laptop person and have it out.
Well, I think there's an interesting thing in there, right, about like how we express ourselves and how we what the things around us mean to us, right? Because to me, my laptop is in itself where I express myself. I'm a massive tech nerd. I've always got the latest laptop, and I keep it in good condition because I plan to sell it and buy the next one as soon as it comes out or whatever. And so just the very fact that I have the latest MacBook or the latest gaming laptop tells people something about me. So that is a way of expressing myself. Whereas I think for other people, a laptop's just a tool. They don't care about it. It's a way of getting work done. But the way they express themselves then is by putting like stickers or other things that kind of show their personality on that laptop, because we all ultimately, it's the same reason we wear like branded t-shirts or whatever, right? Or you at least pick colors that we like, or decorate our houses. It's all just ways of kind of expressing our personality so that people understand who we are. And that's like quite a deep need that we have, right, for people to understand us. So
it's I can't remember the word for it. It's potentially a bit like, I went to a workshop the other week and I can't remember the name of the word, but it's where like termites leave something physical in the environment, so that the other termites will then know how to behave, and it creates these termite mounds, or something turgy, where ants will do a thing and leave a pheromone behind, and that leaves a message for the other ants who then will follow. And I'm going to look it up. I went to a workshop by John Clapham about it. What am I even Googling?
I have to say though, this whole conversation has made me realize how much I have a tendency to over-intellectualize things, because this is now where we've gone from talking about stickers on laptops, which is interesting.
The termites leaving messages in the environments. No, but then that's just giving me things for termite magazines. Anyway, there's some sort of biological phenomenon whereby like altering the environment socially can lead to certain types of behavior. And for termites, it's like I do a little bit of termite mound building, and then the next termite, every other termite has a heuristic, which is if I see a bit of mound, go build there. And then it builds a little thing, and then the other people go and the other termites go and build there. And it's similar with desire paths, where people walk a more convenient route, even if it's not paved, and it creates a sort of local attractor. So I wonder if at some point someone put a sticker on their laptop from a conference, and someone else said, "Oh, that's cool. Now I know what languages you're into and what kind of nerd you are. Maybe I'll do that as well." And then before you know it, everyone's like modifying their environments around them. I'm going to find the name of the thing.
It's interesting. It makes me think. It makes me think of I can't remember which conference I was at, but there was a graffiti artist of all people talking at this web conference that I went to. It was Webstock, and there's a really interesting phenomena with when you think about graffiti as a thing that humans do, right? We go out into the world and we kind of paint things that don't belong to us to kind of leave our mark behind, which feels like a very similar kind of like animalistic attempt to leave our mark on the world. But there's also this really interesting relationship that you see when, so for one, the number of people, or in particular kids that get drawn into graffiti art, they tend to come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And why is that? When you consider this thought of, well, this is one of the simplest and cheapest and easiest ways that I, as a person that's unlikely to feel seen or heard, can make myself seen or heard. And so you tend to see that as like poverty decreases, you see less graffiti, which is just interesting in and of itself. But then you've also seen a similar thing as the internet has become more common, because now people have other avenues to make themselves feel like they're being heard by going to like Reddit or Facebook or whatever it is and talking to people. And so you'd see graffiti less now than you used to in, let's say, the 80s. And again, I don't necessarily know exactly what that all means, but there's something really interesting in there about this kind of connection we might have with termites or bees or other animals, and this inherent need to kind of put our thoughts and our personality in the world in a place where people see it, so that we feel like individuals and not just like unseen workers, If someone would have gifted Banksy a Substack membership, he may not have had Banksy. He would have had another place. Exactly.
If he'd the internet.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be the name of my next Substack post. Graffitiing the Internet by Daniel Susser. Just
nice.
Be putting my mad ideas, just my little corner, my little wall. There's I can't remember where I heard it, but the claim that art preceded language in humans. Oh, citation needed. But the idea that we want to express ourselves visually, and we want to bring these, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, bringing metaphors and saying, I'm going to paint a gazelle because that's important to me as a gazelle hunter, and put that on the wall and make a sort of iconic representation of that, goes deeply into what it means to be a human. What does that mean for us in our agile teams?
I don't know. So I guess there's a really interesting sort of side thought there about the realization I think a lot of us have gone through over the last couple of decades, at least, of visual tools being more useful as a way to collaborate and to get work done than verbal tools, right? Like, we know that written requirements are not as good as drawn diagrams. We know that whiteboards are generally better than knowledge management systems, right? Like, this is stuff that we've seen. And I wonder if part of it is actually the ambiguity. I think there's a trick that we kind of, or a trap that we fall into as humans, where we think that when we verbalize something, because we use language that's quite precise, that we therefore think that we're on the same page with people. Whereas when you draw things or when you visualize things, it's inherently less precise. And so you have to dive into a deeper conversation about what's really going on. And that kind of draws out things that otherwise would have been missed. I think we've all seen this a million times, right? When you take let's say you use a story, something that's been written down, and then you ask people to kind of draw a picture of what they think this means. And all of a sudden we disagree where we thought we agreed before. And I think it's like the trap of a highly verbal society is we trick ourselves into thinking we know things better than maybe we do.
It's that whole picture paints 1,000 words thing. The example I was thinking is, like, if I say dog, I could either... You might have an image of a dog, whereas if I paint a dog, then I'm painting a particular kind of dog, and I can get across maybe what I mean by that dog, and potentially all the other stuff, like all the other associations with dog that you might have. But it's more precise, and I'm wondering if we go like a level above that, like, why is that the case? Well, and this might seem trite, but it's one of these deep, for me, what seems like a deep thing that is present everywhere, which is we live in a world with lots of information can be accessed visually, so it makes sense that our brains have evolved in a way that makes more meaning visually from the world than it does conceptually or in language or in words, which are useful for another kind of information passing between people and discussion and putting together logical concepts or whatever. But the eye has evolved through convergent evolution in lots of different ways, lots of different times through the invent of biology, for a reason, right? It's a good way of understanding this kind of world around us. So we're well adapted to that, and we're not well adapted to a word-based system. Maybe if there wasn't light coming from the sun and we evolved in some other way, then yeah, information passing would be through sound, and we'd be much more adept at passing words to each other. But we're not. We're built with these, what's the estimation? Either 50 or 80%, but again, I'll find the citation, put it in the show notes, of our brain architecture maps to the visual cortex. I'm skeptical, or I'm reluctant to say, 50% of the brain taken up with vision, but it's numbers like that. Like, our vision architecture contacts and seems to interrelate with lots of parts of our brain more than the other senses.
Yeah, and again, I'm no expert on this, so I'm careful. I don't want to say anything that's going to be completely wrong, but I'm a bit of a hobbyist evolutionary biologist, and I've read a lot of stuff on that. And I think it was in Robin Dunbar's book, someone will correct me, that I read about the interesting new understanding we've gotten about human evolution, in that we used to think that Neanderthals were a separate dead end of human evolution that kind of died out, but we now know that we actually interbred, and essentially we're commonly ascended from both, or descended from both, like Homo habilis and other primates and Neanderthal. And the really interesting thing is when you discover that Neanderthal lived further north on the Earth, right? And so they lived in places where there was a lot more darkness, where it got darker earlier, it got light later in the day. And so one of the reasons that they have that telltale, like, large ridged forehead is because they had bigger brains to deal with all of the extraocular processing that they had to do. So because there was just more brain power that had to go to decoding a darker view, that was part of how they evolved. And so then when we crossbred with Neanderthals, there was an effect of a sizable increase in human brain size, but because of being a crossfeeding breeding phenomenon, we didn't just inherit their ocular processing. We inherited larger brain size, but that was maybe a bit more spread out. Let's say it gave more potential brain power to humans, or at least more brain size, that almost certainly then affected our evolution and allowed us to even further evolve into more conscious or more advanced. None of these words seem like a fair representation, but you know what I'm getting at. It's like it's because we inherited a part of the brain that was all about just seeing stuff, that actually we got more intelligent as a species. And that to me is the bit that just seems super interesting, is the way that so much of our brain is potentially just dedicated to that thing. And so, of course, that's where a lot of our thinking is going to happen as well, right?
So as a practical person who is going to go to work on Monday and has to, do my job as per the job description or whatever, what do I do with this perspective that vision is so important? And I'm really consciously trying to stop myself going further into vision cognitive science. But maybe we can get back there later, because it's holding back the flood.
Yeah. Well, no, but I think it's an interesting realization for a lot of people, right? Is that actually visuals are a better way to communicate than words. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, I was at a workshop with Alina Glindevi, the visual agile coach, and she does a lot of awesome work on how to use visuals to facilitate conversations and all that kind of stuff. And I guess the two things I learned from that workshop was that, one, I'm absolutely terrible at drawing anything, and I need to work on that skill. But number two is that it actually doesn't matter, because the conversation it draws out is still more robust than a conversation that you would have by starting from words. And that, to me, is just a really interesting insight, because we just default to words all the time. Drawing a picture or doing something like that is the exception, not the rule. And yet we know that humans tend to be visual thinkers in the vast majority. So maybe we should flip that on its head, and maybe we should actually try starting from pictures with everything and then only move to words once we've done that. I think that could be a really interesting experiment for a team.
Yeah. Or at least have an option to know that our visual processing is important. So it should factor in, or we should default to it, or we should have an option for it, or we should know that it's available. And I was thinking, and there's a few different levels of it, right? And an example that just came to mind is when I was working in government and we had some incident on something had broken, something had gone wrong. And a bunch of people, everyone was together trying to work out how to fix it. And I think the most useful thing I did, just using my own podcast to talk about how brilliant I was, I can edit that bit out, but I won't. Was taking all the different approaches and just putting them on a board, even in words, right? So this person thinks we should do X, this person thinks we should do Y. Let's just get them all out in front of us so we can consider them alongside each other, as opposed to having to hold them all in our head. That's actually quite useful. So then we can say, right, which of these do you think is going to be most useful or most effective? And then people swarmed onto them and said, actually, let's do that one as the second choice thing to do, and let's go for this one first. And making the words visible and something that we could look at was super useful. And then at the other end of the spectrum is drawing pictures and how are you feeling today, and everyone draw your own emoji or whatever. All these are ways of using visual thinking. You don't have to be drawing icons. I think I was in that same workshop potentially at Agile Manchester. It doesn't have to be icons and getting really good at drawing turtles if you want to represent slowness. There can be other ways of doing that without having to go into the rabbit hole of visual workshops and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think because to that point, right, there's word clouds are a really good example of that, of how you can make words visual, right? There's no drawing required for a word cloud, but it adds a layer of understanding that's not there if you just write down a sequence of words. And I think the point you were just making is that there's an awful lot you can do actually by just taking the words of the things and just putting them in a physical space, so that you can start to get a sense of the relational connection between things, or the distance between things, or there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of leverage that visual mindset, let's call it. But again, I'm going to now keep using that word because I've put it in the front of my brain. You can use that visual approach without ever needing to draw a picture in the traditional sense, right? You can literally just put words on a whiteboard. And this is why I think we use sticky notes a lot, right? Agile coaches love the sticky notes. It's because it's a really, really great way of taking something that would otherwise just be a static word and saying, well, does it go here? Does it go here? Are these things connected? Is this at the top or at the bottom, right? That gives us an entirely new dimension for talking about things that is actually really difficult to just do with words, right? And an easy example of that is if you ask people to talk about their list of priorities, you will usually, if you ask them on 2 different days, you'll get 2 different things. Whereas if it's written down in a visual space, it has a consistency to it. It remains. There's a what's the word I'm looking for? There's a permanence to a visual representation of something that you would very rarely get from just words alone.
So in cognitive science, you'd call that the extended mind. And this is Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers wrote a paper in 1999, which I know 1999 because I watched a video about it yesterday, so I'm not like a Rain Man over here. But they're called the extended... I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called the extended mind hypothesis or something like that. And they give a thought experiment of Otto and Inga go to the museum, and Otto has some sort of memory degeneration. He has Alzheimer's and has to remember the location by keeping it on a notebook. And he keeps all information like that on a notebook that he always keeps about his person. So he looks up museum, goes to the address, and then works his way there. Whereas Inga remembers it in her memory and she just goes to the address. And their philosophical argument, they're both philosophers and cognitive scientists, and in the overlap between them, they argue that those things are equivalent. Because everything that you could claim about Inga's process of retrieving her memory, you could claim about Otto's process as well. Just because I remember it like in my wet notebook in my head, so too Otto does it in this paper one. And Otto could lose his notebook. Well, Inga could lose the location of the address as well in her mind and forget it. And all these things are the same. And actually, our cognition isn't just limited to where my skin ends. It goes beyond us into our tools, into our stories. And that's the visual piece there was how I can extend my mind onto a whiteboard, or I can get the extended mind of me and my colleagues onto a whiteboard together so that we can look at it. And if we see these things as part of cognition rather than just like, I don't know, nice, pretty pictures, or I don't know anyone that thinks these things are nice, pretty pictures, but we can give them a sort of centrality to the way that we think. And really, this is what it means to be human, is to have an extended mind, including such things as these visual tools.
Yeah, and so I think that the super interesting part about that is when you start thinking about the way that becomes a collaborative, not an individual thing, right? We talk about, the intelligence of crowds and all this stuff, but if my mind can be extended onto a whiteboard and your mind can be extended onto a whiteboard, then to some extent we have now combined our minds, right? We've given ourselves an ability to leverage what both of us know and think and feel in a way that's much harder to do in the format of just a one-to-one conversation where it's I'm giving you words, you're thinking, and you're giving me words. Whereas when we put stuff together, we can, if we've drawn a picture together and then I make a change without saying a word, that immediately affects something in your brain. It's almost like direct access memory in a way that I can almost influence what's in your brain just by making a change to this shared space that we're working on, which is incredibly powerful when it comes to working together on complex issues. And without wanting to maybe go down this particular rabbit hole, this is one of the reasons that I think that we have done ourselves a disservice in the last few years by not sticking more strongly to working in person more often than not is a positive and a good thing for us to do. Because yes, there are tools that can kind of make up for some of that gap, but I still have never seen anything quite like a team of 5 people that really understand a problem getting in front of a whiteboard. I've never seen that emulated through digital tools in the same way and to the same degree. And I think really just reiterates that point of how powerful that kind of way of working can be.
Something that just came up for me is like the way that a Zoom conversation, only one person can talk at any one time. So you only get like one feed into the shared narrative of what's going on, and it's kind of linear. Whereas when you're in a group, you can have 2 people having like a little like side conversation and come back and then go back to the main topic, and then everyone's listening, and then we break apart for a minute, or someone appends or just like puts in a little comment, which on Zoom would be hard because you'd have to say, well, I want to shut you up, and just say, talk over you or wait until you're finished. Whereas in the room, it can be a lot more organic. And there's something about, I don't know if this maps well, but like Zoom is quite a fragile environment. Like only one person gets to talk, and you have to have a really clear process about how we do that and how we facilitate, whereas in the room, it can be frustrating in the room because you're like, can everyone just pay attention, please? But if everyone's engaged in the topic, then we kind of want people to pay as much attention as they need to, and then have their attention divert and go and solve a little contributing problem or go and bring in another idea. And the organic unwinding of that thing in the room where there are more senses available and there's more ways of having extended minds and connecting with each other is incredibly useful for problem solving. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and so there's another part of that I find interesting is the way that we often try to categorize or I'm going to say box people. Maybe that's not entirely fair, but so one of the things that I often hear when I make these sorts of arguments about how we should prioritize in-person working over remote working, one of the things I will often hear is that this is unfair to introverts, for example, and that in fact that the more remote things or Zoom that they are better for introverts, which is something I find kind of bizarre because I am an introvert to an extreme degree in a way that often surprises people. And I think this is because we've come to conflate introversion with shyness or anxiety or a number of other things that are often co-related but not the same thing. And it just makes me think of how what's the word I'm looking for? How less effective I might be at what I now do if early in my career people had said to me, oh, well, no, it's okay, you're an introvert, so you don't have to learn to talk in meetings, you don't have to learn to do these things, you don't have to learn to make your voice heard, speak up and do these other things. And it's only because I realized that my introversion isn't a handicap, it's just, it takes more energy for me to be involved in a social or group or interaction than perhaps it does for others, but that's still a thing that I can work on. And it led me to putting myself in those situations in a way that has now made me more effective at what I do. And I think that the trap that we then fall into with things like Zoom meetings is we look at it as, well, okay, now what we can do is we can put everyone on mute and say, Mr. Introvert, now you've got your 2 minutes to speak. What would you like to say? But then that person's not actually learning how to interact in a way that maybe is more useful to the group. It's just more useful to themselves. And again, I think this is one of my views that potentially gets me in trouble. I know a lot of people dislike what I'm saying, but I think if it is true that in-person collaboration is more effective, it doesn't actually matter that some people find it less palatable than others. That's because that's not what we're actually trying to achieve with complex problem solving, right? We're trying to find the best solution to the problem, not the most comfortable solution to the problem. And I think that's a thing that's hard for a lot of people to hear sometimes.
So I would yes and that, in that, like, yes, that we need to optimize for the fact that we're trying to solve a problem, in which case doing it together and giving the introverts the space to within that to be able to collaborate well and not like be overly sensitive to the introverts. I'm trying to speak very carefully here because I'm not an introvert. I don't want to be like saying I'm pandering to their silly need to be happy. I don't want to say something like that. But like over optimizing for that preference means that you do have to have groups of people where they can collaborate and talk and exchange ideas freely is kind of necessary or good or better. And also, as the facilitators or the conveners of those spaces, we then need to work out how to do that in a way that gives the recharge time. Or if we have a morning of workshops, then we create space for the team to choose that after a 3-hour workshop or a 3-hour pair programming, mobbing, whatever session where the introverts will be completely drained and the extroverts will be fucking buzzing, that there is a space for everyone to be able to recharge in the way that they need, but it doesn't come at the cost of like the general collaboration that we do. And in general, like, I'll put this to you, like as an introvert, my guess would be that if you're doing work that you like and care about with people that you like and have an affinity with, you can bear the drainingness of those workshops a bit easier. You just need some time to recharge afterwards. Is that roughly right, or have I got it wrong?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, as in, I have to take deliberate time in the day. Like, so for an example, I think we even talked about this when I was at the conference, is that I have to do lunch by myself. Lots of people, when they go to conferences, they love doing the group lunch together in the middle of the day. Whereas for me, I have to go away and just get a bit of time to myself. Because if I don't, I really, really struggle come the end of the day. And in fact, last week when I was at a different conference, I didn't have lunch by myself and I really suffered for it. But it's, I again, to go back to something I mentioned earlier about the way we sometimes conflate these things, it's like introverts often have anxiety as a result of being maybe put in those situations and not being given that chance to recharge. They develop an anxiety about social situations, as I certainly have. And then we conflate these two things. So we say, well, because introverts often have anxiety, we're going to treat all introverts as if they're anxious, and therefore it becomes about an almost like psychological treatment more than it is like a problem-solving exercise. And for me, the answer is, like you say, it's about, well, how do we make sure that we've just considered these different approaches? And liberating structures is one example of a great way you can solve for a lot of this stuff. Is if you do some 1, 2, 4 all, then you give people who find it harder to jump into an ongoing conversation a space to get involved, but you can still do it in a collaborative way. You still get a chance for everyone to come together. You give people breaks throughout the day and all that stuff. None of that requires saying, well, now we have to just do everything via Zoom because the introverts prefer it, which is obviously that's not actually what anyone's saying, but I think that there's a tendency in that direction that makes me a bit uncomfortable.
For those that haven't come across liberating structures, what is it? What is 1, 2 for all?
Yeah, so I always forget. I need to explain things. So liberating structures is a collection of techniques that are built to encourage collaboration in different environments and of different people of different backgrounds and all that stuff, so including things like introversion and extroversion. And so there are a bunch of ways that you could facilitate sessions, run meetings, whatever you want to call it, to kind of get the most out of people. And 1, 2, 4 all is one. It's probably the most commonly used liberating structure. So I would encourage you to go and Google it, read the book, and look at some others. But 1, 2, 4 all is just super easy. But the thing about 1, 2, 4 all is it's really easy. Anyone can do it. And it's where instead of just saying, hey, here's a question, let's all have a group discussion about it, you say, right, everyone just by yourself, think about this question, write some stuff down and take a moment to think about it on your own. Then pair up with someone else and talk about what you wrote down and what you thought. Have them share in a small group setting. Then for the pairs will group into a group of 4, do the same, and then eventually we do like a big playback where one person from each of those groups of 4 gets a chance maybe to share back. And so it allows you, without needing to put anyone on the spot, to give everyone a chance to think, give people the opportunity to talk in a big group setting but not be forced to, and it solves a lot of those problems with group scenarios with introverts and extroverts, right?
Yeah, that's a great explanation. And as the people who, like I said, convene these meetings or facilitate them, there's a word you used that I want to pick up on, which definitely I use as well, but I'm trying to challenge myself on it, which is the idea of like giving people breaks or giving people space. And I wonder, or I reckon that it would be good for us to rethink the model there, which is that we are the ones with the power, giving people their time back, right? This meeting's ending early, let me give you your time back. Well, there's alternatives there, which is like, I'm convening and you're saying yes, and you're giving me permission to like hold you in a room together. Thank you. It's your time. So it's my job as facilitator to ask and to glean from that room, like, what is the best way to spend this time? What's the best way to make the best use of all your energy? What's the best way to solve this problem as a group? Is it individually for a couple of hours and then come back, or is it as a group now? And if I have a sense that I am giving people the choice or the break or the whatever, it's still a very centralizing role, and that's sort of the antithesis of what we want to be doing a lot of the time. Discuss.
Yeah, so I think you're right in the basic premise of we have to get in the mindset of it's a collaborative exercise, and as a facilitator, I'm just here to enable us to decide how we best want to use this time. The reason that I actually don't think, and I'll probably need to spend a few days thinking about this now you've said it, but the reason I don't think that it's a language issue in this case, or why I don't have a problem with using it that way, I'm going to go slightly out of left field and use an example of companies that introduce unlimited annual leave allowances. So this is an experiment that's been done in a bunch of companies, right? We give people just to take annual leave. All you need to do is just, prove it, make arrangements, and then there's no limit to the amount of annual leave that you're allowed to take. And in almost every circumstance that's been done, people end up taking less annual leave than if they had just had, say, 4 weeks or 6 weeks in the year that they get to use. And I think this is the same.
If you're listening to this in America, what we mean is 5 days or 6 days.
Yeah.
Sorry. Couldn't help that.
Exactly. But I guess so the point there is humans are actually really, really rubbish in general as a category, right? So not all of us, but most of us, especially including myself, I do this really a lot, is I will not take breaks if there is work to be done. I will not step out of a conversation if I believe that other people around me might be harmed by me stepping out of a conversation. If I believe that people are finding my presence valuable, I don't want to deprive them of it, let's say, which is the most egotistical way I could possibly phrase that. But I'm sure you get what I mean. We by general, we don't want to negatively impact people around us, I think is the best way to put it. And so when we're doing group activities, it's really, really easy, and I think it's a bit of a cop-out in a way, or it could become a cop-out if we just say, well, actually, I need you to tell me when you need a break, or, because ultimately it is going to be up to the facilitator in whatever role they're in, if there is one, to kind of make that present, make that known. There is a central element to it. And I guess the point that I'm making is, yes, you shouldn't be doing things like, oh, we're done 10 minutes early, so I'm going to give you 10 minutes back. I think that's pretty dicey language. But things like, I think we need to take a break, and so I'm going to give you all a break, is sort of a way of saying, I don't think that if we don't direct certain self-care, that self-care might not happen. And so sometimes it's in people's best interest to do that.
So I nearly agree with you. I would say, like, I agree with the part that is like, we need to bring in the options for those kind of things, or we need to create constraints, to use complexity language. We need to be aware of the fact that I haven't taken a break in a while, and it's not just about waiting until someone says, like, for God's sake, can we get off this call? But there's a difference between, I'm going to give you all a break now, and I noticed that we've been going for 45 minutes and it's been quite intense. Hands up if you need a break. Okay, let's come back in 10. Great. Which is very different from, we're going to take a break now. And some people might be like, I was actually in the middle of the flow there. I don't want to do a break now. I'm good until lunch. And I think it's about noticing that, and noticing the ways in which the annual leave behavior or things like that might be playing out in ways we don't want. And then still having an inclusive and non-centralizing power role in how that stuff gets resolved. Still taking it to the team, to use Lisa Adkins's phrase. So, yeah, I think there's definitely something there, and we have to bring some structure to work with.
Right. Yeah, I think there's another element there, because I do agree with what you just said, and I think that's what you described is basically how I run all of my training, for example. Right? Is I'll say I'm aiming for a break roughly every hour. We'll go with the flow. I'll often ask and say, hey, we're at 45 minutes. Do we want a break? Do we want to power through? I think that's the right way to do a lot of that. But I do think that kind of does start with acknowledging that whether we want to be in control or not, we are, right? There's a social expectation, if you're the person that's helping people learn a topic, that you're also kind of minding the times, let's say, or the constraints. But I think the bit that goes a bit further that's interesting to me is if we don't consider, or if we don't actively make space for the worst tendencies of all of us. See, again, I'm not trying to categorize other people. I'm saying this is me too, which is to not give enough personal care. Sometimes it is okay to say, no, actually, we need to take a break, right? Like I think this kind of goes to sometimes the coaching world in particular, I think has gone too far down this path of coaching is always just reflective and listening and never giving guidance or direction or any of those things, which to me it's always a middle ground. It always has been. But I think that's one of those places it can become a bit dangerous, is if we look at it as, well, I'm never allowed to direct someone, for example, which is a view that I know some coaches hold. Then if you see someone that's just, worked 4 hours, headphones on, drinking a bunch of coffee and not taking a break, is it actually morally okay? Is it in their best interest? Is it the right thing to do to not go up to them and say, hey, you should take a break? They obviously can still ignore you. They don't have to listen to you. You're not in charge in that sense. But I think sometimes giving direction is actually more helpful to people to kind of snap them out of potentially destructive behaviors, which we are all capable of sometimes. I'm
interested in the evolutionary biology hobbying that you mentioned earlier. What else has been catching your attention in that world?
So honestly, it's not something I've spent that much time on recently, so I'm certainly out of date on a lot of stuff. I think the thing that originally got me into it was reading a bunch of Richard Dawkins' old work. So The Selfish Gene, I think, is one of the most interesting books that everyone should read, and kind of shines new light on human behavior. But yeah, it was. I think Robin Dunbar was the one that really his book that I think was literally just called Human Revolution. His or her. It occurs to me I actually don't know if Robin Dunbar is male or female now that I'm saying that out loud. But that's where the Dunbar number comes from. We often talk about that in Agile, the kind of maximum number of so it's the maximum number of social relationships that humans can maintain, and it's a series of circles, and so you can maintain kind of 10 close relationships, so that would be your close and immediate family. You can maintain about 50 sort of interim relationships, so that would be like community, close friends, and then at about 250, that's the maximum number of relationships in like a village or an entire, people that you can be acquaintance of. And there's a lot of interesting science behind why this is, but essentially it's often used in the Agile world to talk about the kind of the maximum size for any given team of teams, and beyond a certain point it just becomes impossible to maintain relationships and therefore to maintain the flow of communication. And I think that the reason it's just an interesting thing for me is because I was reading that book on evolutionary biology the very first time I interviewed for a role in a Scrum team before I really knew anything about Agile. And I just happened to mention that I was reading this thing about Dunbar's number, and everyone was like, oh yeah, we are very familiar with that. And I hadn't realized that it had making its way into the Agile world. And I always find it interesting now when you often hear people reference it, and I don't think most people even know that it comes from evolutionary biology. They imagine it's some kind of like management or organizational design theory, but it's actually a lot deeper than that, which is one of the reasons we tend to know it's probably fairly accurate.
Yeah, or at least the word accurate triggered me there. Or at least at least convergently interesting, right? Like coming from a different field that's
Yeah, I guess maybe the word I should have used is it's probably more rigorously tested, because there's a lot of nonsense in the business management and Agile world where we just kind of take some anecdotal stuff and pretend that it's a law of nature. Evolutionary biology isn't exactly the hardest of sciences either, so it's not physics. But again, it's been many years since I've read that book now, but there's a lot of interesting stuff in there about the way our brains developed as we started cooking food, and there's a lot of thought that went into it. It wasn't just observation of what was happening; it was a study of why it was happening, right? Which I think is maybe one of the things we miss a lot in the business world.
Yeah, definitely. There's a whole thing about precocial versus altricial species. Have you heard that?
No, I don't know those words at all.
I didn't know them until 2 days ago. I'm in the process of listening to a brilliant series by a cognitive scientist called Fred Cummins, who is actually coming on the podcast next week.
Nice.
And I don't know when this one will come out, so whatever. Coming on the podcast next at some point. And yeah, he introduced this idea in his Introduction to Cognitive Science series from University College Dublin. That was a lot of background information that wasn't necessary. Precocial, from the word precocious, is like a young precocious person is like very capable from a young age. So like a deer that can be born and within 5 minutes is walking and eating and doing all that kind of stuff. Versus altricial, I think is the word, which is humans are one of the most altricial species, in that we're like totally fucking helpless as soon as we come out of the womb, and we need a lot of help and care. And I think I read this in a book called Convergence many, many years ago. That was, or maybe it's in Sapiens or one of those, whatever. That as our brains, as we began to walk more upright, that, let's see if we can do it. As you are on 4 limbs, it's easy to give birth. And as we started to become more upright, to be able to like look at the savannah more and have different kinds of interaction, you get higher up, you can see what's going on, you can plan a bit better. It also allows you to have a bigger brain. So you can support a big brain on top of your body rather than like dangling off your body a lot more. So we were able to support bigger brain evolution. But as that happens, birth gets harder because you're upright. So for some reasons of some kind of birth canal type thing that I don't really understand, it's harder to give birth to a big thing standing up than it is on for an all fours creature. Which the birth canal shrank, I think, to be able to allow the hips and the walking and all that kind of stuff. So we ended up having to give birth earlier and earlier in the development of a fetus, which means that, so as we get more intelligent, we have to give birth, and more upright, we have to give birth earlier and earlier, which means that society has to evolve around that, and we become more and more altricial as we give birth to these more, I don't want to say premature, but more underdeveloped creatures that can't speak or feed or walk or do anything like that. And in the process, then we develop a culture and a set of social conventions and habits and patterns that are based around looking after static, helpless babies. And then that's how a lot of the collaboration and all the different stuff that makes humans so human evolves around that. It's all about the uprightness and the size of the brain and the development of the fetus. That was probably a butchering of that concept. Something that I've been thinking about more recently. So my degree was natural sciences, so I've studied some of this genetics stuff apparently not very well, at university, and that's like my grounding field, if that doesn't sound too pretentious. It's my podcast. I can sound pretentious if I like. It's fine. You're welcome to stop listening if you don't like it. Is seeing our teams and organizations like organisms that are evolving according to things that are akin to selective pressures in environments, looking for niches in which we can survive and thrive. And that's a cool lens to look at it at, because we say things like selective pressures, which are like elements of the environment which make certain traits more or less likely to proliferate. That is what a selective pressure is. So, for example, if I am in some archipelago somewhere and the El Nino comes, which is this period of a year of extreme weather, or I can't remember how long it is, but it's a period of extreme weather where all of a sudden all of the animals that can't survive a big storm die. Right, that's what's called an evolutionary bottleneck, where you just have the ones that are like happen to be good at surviving extreme weather, all of a sudden are the only ones left, in which case they can proliferate in this new ecosystem that has been created after the bottleneck. And that creates all sorts of wild changes and preferences within the ecosystem for certain types of genes, certain types of trait that wouldn't be selected for in a more chill, stable environment. And I was talking to a friend of mine last week, and we were thinking about like government. I'm about to go start a job at the government digital service, and government digital is quite stable and static, and until I get there, when it's all going to be there's certain forces at play in that ecosystem that mean that certain things will stay the same. You know, in the UK, we have the government digital service came up with a service standard and a bunch of ways of like recruiting for certain roles that it just makes it a bit harder to change that all the way across government. Like delivery manager is a thing. It's akin to a scrum master or an agile coach, and it's in all the digital teams across government. That means that it's unlikely that it's all just going to go in a heartbeat. Like that's a lot of people that will be impacted. It's a lot of process that has to change. Whereas in like some crazy startup, you could have an agile person come in or a product person, and then the new CTO comes in and changes that whole thing, and it's a lot more volatile. And I wonder if we see that as the kind of El Nino versus, I don't know, static savanna kind of model, where you get certain types of evolution of behavior and practice and team in the government static, stable thing than you would in an El Nino type startup environment.
Yeah, and to use another analogy that I think might have some problem solving power for us if we can get there. So I can't remember which book I read this in now. So if you know, you can tell me. But there was a really interesting study that was done on the wingspan of birds in the English countryside. And what happens is a new motorway was put through this particular stretch of land, and within a few years, right, so a very, very short span of time, there was a noticeable and fairly significant reduction in the average wingspan of the birds that lived near and around this motorway. And the reason for that, or the kind of explanation for that, is because large wingspans are better for burning less energy flying over long distance. Shorter wingspans are better for maneuverability, for instance, getting out of the way of a passing truck. And so this motorway going in creates an immediate and powerful selective pressure. The birds that can't adjust to direction quickly almost certainly get squashed. The ones that can adjust quickly survive, they reproduce. And it kind of is a testament to how quickly evolutionary pressures can create measurable changes, observable changes in the right circumstances. And to the organizational design perspective of this, when you talk about these organizations that are very, very stable and things are potentially unlikely to change, there's one argument to be made for maybe they don't need to change, but then there's another argument for, well, actually they do, and if we don't get up to speed now, that could become an existential threat. And I think that's the argument a lot of Agile people would probably make. And so the question then becomes, well, how do you put a freeway through this organization, right? What's the constraint or the pressure or the thing that you can introduce that creates that rapid selective pressure? It makes me think actually of, I think it's John Cotter's change model that starts with creating a sense of urgency on his 8 steps of change. And it's that concept is that, well, actually sometimes the thing you need is the truck that's going to come in and crush the really, really slow ones to make us realize that we need to stop being slow. And I know that's like a really horrible analogy, but I think, to use a slightly nicer approach is sometimes we need to rip the Band-Aid off some of our interim solutions that are causing us pain and allow that pain to be felt so that we suddenly realize that actually some of this stuff that we're doing is maybe not as effective as we think it is.
COVID is a big motorway that was installed in the middle of everyone's organization,
right.
In the middle. We realized that a lot of the old practices that made sense in that ecosystem, or like were at least able to survive, even if they weren't super well adapted or whatever, had to go. And all of a sudden, a lot of change was able to happen. A lot of process was able to be overrun in the process of that unfolding. And there's also something about like recognizing which kind of ecosystem you're in. So one of the things that you hear a lot in the Agile world is, well, like change is everywhere, right? So you need to be able to change and keep up, or you'll die, or you'll be overtaken by your competitors. Now, if you're working for the Home Office, you don't really have any competitors, right? Or someone else's home office or whatever, or your competitors are gangs or criminals or whatever. I worked at the Ministry of Justice, where like the prisons were the prisons. The process was roughly the same. It was just a case of like keeping up with the technology and trying to make it as good as possible in light of like a slightly changing policy landscape. But it wasn't like crazy new policy was coming in about how we deal with prisons. It was all very incremental and very small, and there's still value to that Agile approach of like having the best thing possible and having the best experiences. But if we come at it and with the assumptions of a really competitive startup who has lots of competition and has to outmaneuver they have to have a high rate of change and change their direction really quickly. Well, that's just not true about a big government department or a big whatever. So I like the organism analogy for an organization or for a team, because organisms are only fit or intelligent in their niche or in their environment. Like a paramecium can move left and right and go straight and do all sorts of complex behavior, and it's perfectly well adapted for a single cell organism environment where all you need to do is avoid poison and eat food, and like that's kind of it. You don't need to like do maths or harness the power of AI. Whereas for your Silicon Valley startups or your whatever, your companies that are trying to keep an edge in a competitive landscape, they will have that's a certain type of niche which has certain types of what the ecological psychologists would call affordances, certain things that they can use in the environment and certain things that are salient to them. And that will be different from a different organization with a different niche that has different selective pressures, that has different requirements and is operating in a different ecosystem. And we, as the Agilists who are trying to work at the team level with all of that, need some model that helps us understand why those things might be different. I don't think complexity quite gets it, because complexity the government type of complexity is different from the startup type of complexity. If we just say it's all just complex, we just need to discover as we go, we may be missing an opportunity to use stuff that we already know about how those ecosystems work to leverage it.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things there, right? Because the first place that my brain went was actually this is where most people get politics and government just inherently wrong, right? Is we treat them as if they are the same as businesses that have customers and a profit motive and competition, right? And things that act as selective pressures that do not exist in the world of government and government organizations, let's say. They can potentially be emulated in a small way, but often they're not. And so you have to use a fundamentally different way of improving or making the thing efficient, let's say. And so I actually wonder if this is where lean as a concept is a much better fit for government organizations than agile is, because agile is, and there's a lot of overlap, and we could get into a lot of the theory about how they're essentially based on a lot of the same thinking. But if I was to give a really simple separation between where these two ideas are based, is agile is based on shortening feedback loops so that you can more quickly adapt, and lean is based on eliminating waste to make your process or approach more efficient. Again, there's a vast oversimplifications. There's a lot of people that are going to potentially disagree with how I've categorized those, but I think for this purpose and for most people, that's a reasonable categorization. And the point in government, right, is that waste is the existential threat to government, right? You only need to look at the NHS. I'm sorry to go political with it, but I don't think anyone's going to disagree with the concept that there is a lot of waste in the NHS, and that creates a lot of problems. And that's because without competition, without proper feedback loops, the cost of things increases, the scale of things increases, and we have no ways to make things more efficient because we can't do the rapid experimentation and comparison, lean startup philosophy of like try a quick experiment and see what happens. You're kind of locked into a lot of these structures that, like you say, are probably not going anywhere. And so actually the thing that you should be really, really focusing in on is how do we maybe introduce some of those selective pressures that kind of emulate competition, but also how do you actually understand and quantify the efficiency of that system, and then look for and improve the bottlenecks and the places where things are working really, really ineffectively. And yes, there's a lot of overlap on those things, but I think that's the mistake a lot of the agile people make, is maybe missing some of the nuance to lean and the context that is useful in. And I think that is, I guess, one of the best examples of that.
And in case you're not aware of like the lean, you as a listener are not aware of the like lean concept of waste, that includes things like waiting time and like queuing and duplication and stuff like that, right? So you could see, if we're applying a really mechanistic understanding to like a hospital with accident and emergency, and at the moment in the UK, hopefully by the time you're listening to this won't be the case anymore, but it's unlikely. The ambulances queue outside the hospital waiting to get in, and when someone calls 999, you have to wait for an ambulance to get free, which means that person's waiting, and that waiting is what you'd call waste, but like that translates or maps to like loss of life and conditions that could be treated if there was time is of the essence. Those conditions could be treated better or solved, and then people die or people get more ill than they kind of need to be, and we'd call that waste in that management speak. But it's not implying that like people who work in the NHS are like inherently wasteful or anything like that. It's more this system creates those kinds of side effects or those kind of features that are that don't achieve the goal, where speed is important.
Right, and I think the way I would categorize it, and I think I'm glad that you picked up on that, because yes, you want to be careful that you don't, that people don't think that we're talking about like individuals as being wasteful, which generally isn't true, right? As we talked about earlier, the system is generally what causes the problems. But the most important factor in any complex system is that given you cannot predict all of the things that are going to happen, waste is inevitable, right? There is always going to be waste that occurs and that kind of starts to gum up the system in a way. And the nature of a complex adaptive system is that generally it has mechanisms and introduces mechanisms to find and adjust those things so that that waste doesn't become an existential problem. But in a more static system, in a complex system that is maybe not adaptive, which, again, if without things like profit motive and feedback loops and actual customers and some of these other things that act as mechanisms to make the system adaptive, then that waste just grows and grows and grows. And I think this is... without wanting to go too political with it, the view that I would generally have is, well, this is why actually centralizing things is generally a bad idea, and this is something we inherently know in business, and we talk about business, but for some reason government still is struggling with, in that, why is it that we have a single giant healthcare system run as a single giant blob? And would it potentially be significantly easier to manage if it was a bunch of decentralized areas, right? Again, I'm not even getting into any of this kind of private versus public stuff. You could still run an entirely public healthcare system that is not nationally centralized. The point of managing complex systems is just that the bigger they get, the harder they are to manage. And so you have to introduce more layers of management, which potentially equates to more layers of waste, and then you end up with systems that just have these runaway waste effects, and which, like you say, things like waiting and overwork and lots of other things. It's never going to be perfect, but
it also speaks to the difficulty of acting in a complex system where you don't know. You can try and do an intervention that you think will help, and it will make things worse. So, for example, again, I'm not totally boned up on the politics of it. Maybe I'll make an edit of this podcast where it's just you and me just cut together saying, I'm not so sure about the politics, the evolutionary biology, the whatever. That could be a fun edit. Daniel and Michael caveat for an hour. But the Langley reforms, Langley, in 2010 were designed to break up the NHS control into different trusts and to give them all different their own budgets and things like that, to do exactly what you were saying, right? Was to create a certain sense of competition and to autonomy, but that led to really difficult problems of integration. And now when we're trying to make integrated services between different hospitals, different GP practices, and it comes down to what is the actual problem you're trying to solve here? Well, as a citizen of the UK or as a healthcare user, my journey isn't just to one hospital and then home. It's to one hospital and then I go on holiday and then I have to talk to that GP there because my leg hurts and they have to get the notes from this place, and I might get sent from Cornwall to London to a specialist centre, and it's a very tightly integrated system. Well, if each hospital is able to procure its own data management system or whatever and has its own standards for its databases, and that stuff isn't thought about end to end, we have this mad situation now where each hospital or each trust was able to procure its own stuff in its own way, and now it's really hard for the data to talk to each other, for the data, whatever layers, to coordinate with each other in ways that we need, and it creates a lot of other kinds of waste, which is suppliers negotiating different trusts down on quantity or that kind of thing to give them essentially less good care, or things that collective bargaining would have been useful, and 5 trusts together buying all the PPE would have been better than each trust doing it by themselves, where they're sort of competing against each other for price. And so there are, you can step in. The message for that is not one about healthcare, because this is not a podcast about healthcare. Well, it's starting to become one, but it's about complex adaptive systems and about the difficulty of doing some big intervention with the best of intentions, knowing that you're going to have unexpected side effects. And sometimes those will be ones you can live with, and sometimes those will be ones that make everything worse. And
right. Yeah. And I think getting back to the kind of the agile point at the heart of all that, right, is, well, the way to remedy that, and it's never going to be perfect, but the way to remedy that is to make sure that you actually have mechanisms for rapidly testing and getting feedback against those things that you think might solve problems. Because, to take that example of, breaking the NHS into trusts, and, I'm relatively new back to the UK, so I actually don't know much about the history of the NHS at all. But the thing that we shouldn't do, and it sounds like perhaps we did, was say, this in theory sounds like a good idea, so let's just do it, and let's just make this sweeping change to this giant system, which is very rarely going to work out the way we want it to. Whereas instead, we should be thinking in that more experimental mindset. It should be, okay, what would this look like if we spin off in one region, one county, one area, a separate area, and allow that to experiment with a different way of doing things and see what we learn from it, and then take those learnings and apply it to a second place and see what they learn, and then work out the integration stuff between those two, and then do another. But obviously, again, without wanting to go too political with it, this is where the problem of politicians working in very short like election cycles and not really having the ability to focus on the long game prevents a lot of that from actually being politically viable, which means that we end up stuck in very short-term thinking, which for large complex adaptive systems is just not going to get us where we need to be. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but
yeah, but I think it's about recognizing what are the constraints on your system. So in politics, like the 4 or 5 year election cycle is a constraint that has a kind of frustrating behavior, anything that would require longer term planning or thinking or ambition. So too, an organization will be constrained by its own budgetary planning system and its own financial planning, and who gets the budget and for under what conditions and how and why. And those things are often within the control of CEOs, CTOs, CFOs to say, we need to bring our organizational processes to the work being done, not the other way around. And it is often the other way around, right? I'll give you a budget for a year because that's easier to account for, and then you have to spend this budget this year. Well, as an agile team trying to discover a new space and trying to adapt what you need, you don't necessarily know what you need. And I was talking to a friend at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war. This person works in the British Army, and he said they'd had some briefing about the difference in approach between the Russian military and the Ukrainian NATO-trained military. And the Russian one was centrally planned. They'd say, go and solve this thing, and you're getting these artillery, go and use them. And then whereas the Ukrainian response, I don't know if things have changed since then, but was very much central command would issue some strategic objectives, capture this hill, secure this city, and then the people who are on the ground would say what they needed. Right, we need some artillery, we need some tanks, we need some soldiers, and then it would be drawn in. And it was very much that David Marquette idea of bringing the authority to the information. Right, so the authority of what do we need to achieve this objective to the information, i.e. the people on the ground doing the work. Whereas in organizations that have this central planning system, for finance or whatever, you're basically giving that authority to the people without the information about what it actually takes to solve the problem. And at the beginning, that can maybe explain the surprising ability of the Ukrainian forces to outmaneuver the Russians. Again, I'm not sure how much that still stands after how long that war has been going on, and we've touched on some big topics today that we're probably not very well equipped to handle. But that kind of approach, you think about that is often within a budget holder, a budget process maker's gift to be able to change that.
Yeah. So the other thing that kind of shines through as you describe that is the importance of understanding the difference between and the use case for a pull system versus a push system, right? Which, again, I don't want to minimize war as a situation. So I don't want to get too into how that should be done. I don't know anything about that as a scenario, but I think the one thing that we generally know about any complex work, and we talk about knowledge work a lot, and the best description I've heard of knowledge work as a definition is that knowledge work is anything in which the person doing the work knows more about the work than their boss does. Which nowadays is most work that we do in, like even war, I would imagine now is actually knowledge work for the most part, because like you say, we've developed these ways of working, and we've got, soldiers working on the front line that are probably significantly more intelligent and informed and understanding of what's going on than command is, because of the way that information is available now and the teaching and training that we have available and all sorts of other factors. And so if you're in that scenario, it does not make sense for the person above, the person controlling the structure, the framework, to be pushing work or ideas or
solutions,
stuff to
strategy,
be done.
tactics.
Yeah, exactly. So, exactly. You can't push that to people because they have information that you don't, and so you need for them to pull that from you based on their information at the time, and that is, again, one of those places where businesses, I think a lot of them are still struggling to adapt, because conceptually it's really, really hard to get your head around as a manager, as a person that has been sort of promoted into this position of, let's say, I want to say higher understanding, which is not a reasonable way to categorize it, but it's the perception, right? It's that as a manager, you go from down here at this low level with this limited view to up here with this bigger level view, and you understand more things. That's, I think, the way a lot of people perceive a step to management.
Or at least higher authority or higher control. People will listen to what you say because they feel like they have to, type thing.
Right. Exactly, and obviously there's a lot of like ego and other things that get tied up in that as well. But even leaving that aside, it's then you've then got the problem of, well, if a decision needs to be made about something and you've got 10 people on the ground that are doing the thing and understand what's going on, who are you to tell them what they should do next? So what your job ultimately should become is maintaining contact with the people who are doing that work, understanding their needs, understanding the situation as they understand it, and listening for their requests for support or material or whatever it is, which inherently turns you into a servant, right? We often use that term servant leader, which I know has fallen a little bit out of favor now, but that, I think, is a hard thing for some people to get into. Is I'm a manager, I'm a leader, I'm whatever, executive, which I want that to mean that I'm now the person that's in charge and control and that knows everything. But actually what it means is that I now need to step into servant mode and serve these other people that have the information, which is just such a difference between how people traditionally have learned about and perceive management that I think we just get it wrong a lot. And that's something that's one of those mindset changes that we might need to work on, at least as individuals, if we can't change others.
I have a theory here about, it's a cognitive sciencey type 1, which is that there's a branch of cognitive science, computational cognitive science, which basically makes a bunch of assumptions that the interesting stuff in cognition takes place in just the brain. And this sort of feeds into a kind of dualistic, there is a separation between mind and body, whereas mind is this higher thing and body is separate, and they are different from each other. And that goes back to Descartes and probably earlier. And if I describe my organization as, if it's a hierarchical one where the head is at the top, why do we refer to it as the head? Because we think the head is we think the head is where the brain is. The head is where the brain is. That's not controversial. But the head, if the interesting bit where the cognition is centered and the only thing that really matters is this computing brain that deals in logical symbols and all this kind of stuff, the claims of computational cognitive science or the different traditions within that, well, then I'm going to have an organization that represents that structure. The interesting stuff happens in the head, right? I.e. the higher ups, the managers. They're doing the interesting thinking, and the people on the ground doing the work, they're just the hands, right? They're just the sensors, or they're just the fingers, and they're just doing what the head instructs them to do. And that's, the cognition happens higher up, and it gets carried out lower down. And it's a one-way feed forward, they would call it, system in which, like, the brain does the thinking and passes in. The brain senses, thinks, passes information down, right? So too my manager or my CEO gets information, thinks, tells my fingers what to do. And that is not how all cognitive science or the dominant models of cognitive science work nowadays. There's what's called the 4E tradition of cognition being embodied and embedded in an environment and extended, like we said earlier, and enacted, which basically means that the interesting parts of cognition are not just in my skull. They are distributed throughout my body. We mentioned ecological psychology earlier, the idea that my cognition doesn't make sense just assuming that I'm an isolated individual. I make sense in an ecosystem. I am part of an ecology. And cognition happens between me and the environment. It happens distributed throughout my body. It happens between my hands and my eyes and my brain. And there's all sorts of interesting ways in which there's a phenomenon called saccades, where our eyes are constantly shifting, looking for things to look at. In which case, like, our body and the muscles operating those eyes are just as intrinsically involved in what is happening with vision as the brain and the sort of downstream bits of the optic nerve and the information that's being passed there. So too, like, our bodies are constantly like shifting in imperceptible ways front and back in order to allow us to get depth perception, in order to allow us to understand our environment. And clearly these things are entangled and intertwined, and the brain does a lot of interesting stuff when it comes to cognition, obviously. But it's also the body that does it, and the hands have their own kind of intelligence. Like, the brain can't play the piano without the hands. And that sounds really trite and cliche, but we would have the imagination that a CEO can sort of like do the job by just issuing instructions, whereas the hands or the people that are dealing with the problem themselves are as equals, if not in some ways more important than the coordinating functions that the brain plays. And I think as a model of like how we're thinking about our organizations and things like that, what does top mean in this case? Well, top means head, means up, means the computational stuff happens there, and bottom means less important, ground, really in contact with earth. And there's a bunch of other ways that we could visualize like power and information and authority and intelligence and cognition throughout our organizations. And that's kind of what my mission's about at the moment, is bringing that cognitive science lens of the ways in which our cognition is dynamic and entangled and intertwined and in the body and all these different ways, and applying it to an organizational level.
No, I think that's a very noble approach, and it's definitely something that people need to understand. The thing that kind of pops back into my brain as you say that from what we were talking about earlier is when I think about the selfish gene and Dawkins' work on understanding genetic selection. And when you think about this concept of the brain and cognition extending beyond the body and into our environment and the people around us, I mean, that actually is borne out in the theory or in the idea of genetic selection, given that your body contains some of the same genes that are in my body. And while they're not conscious, you can treat them as if they know that that's true. There are genes in my body that know that you contain some of the same genes and will sometimes do things or encourage in me behaviors or instill in me ways of thinking that consider the fact that my actions can affect you and that you are in a sense a part of me. You have some of those same genes. And there's a lot of really interesting studies on the way that actually plays out in terms of like sibling familiarity and how much we'll be willing to risk our lives for people that are related to us, and how it's directly proportional to how much genetic structure we share in common with them. All sorts of cool stuff. But I think that the bit that it kind of ties into is that like thinking about those flocks of birds that you see, the starlings that fly in the sky, and they form these incredible patterns that never crash into each other. Yeah, and this is something that happens because each starling is individually just focusing on the starling to its immediate left, right, and front, and they all know that they share the same thought pattern, the same genes that encourage this behavior, that mean that because they're all behaving in the same way, they can rely on the fact that everyone behaves in the same way and therefore not have to think about the whole system. They can just behave in their immediate collaborative, cooperative area, let's say. And this is the way that really, really amazing, complex human systems can come to be like giant organizations that work, is because we are aligned on purpose, or because we, even because we potentially share some genetic relationship or even some cultural understanding, there are assumptions that we can make about the way that we're all going to behave that allow us to offload some of that thinking, because we don't need to think about the whole system. If we all just focus on those immediate relationships, the system naturally takes care of itself because we have those shared interests. And I think that for me is a big part of where we need to do a better job in our organizations today of really understanding what those uniting factors are, because if you take care of those things, if you take care of the uniting factors of the things that we agree on, the thinking that we can otherwise offload, it allows us to really, really focus on those immediate cooperative and collaborative relationships. That is where the value comes from, right? Which is what we want to spend more of our time on. So,
yeah. And there's the next area that I see myself sort of delving into is this world of the studying of ants and antelopes and hives and swarms and like my biology is not the same as a locust in lots of important ways. So it means that I'm not going to act like a swarm of locusts together. But the beautiful thing that we get to do as agilists or as organizational thinkers or something like that is choose the models and the sources of inspiration for our experiments, right? And we get to go, well, hang on, antelopes do this thing where they put the predator between them and another antelope, and that causes this behavior that makes it better for the antelopes or the gazelles to like self-organize in a way that makes them less likely to get eaten. And they're all doing that, and that is kind of cooperative behavior. What can we learn from that? How can that help me structure my teams? How can that help me think about patterns or constraints or small rules of thumb? Or there's the thing Napoleon who came up with the march towards the sound of the gunfire. March towards the sounds of the gun. Like, if you're in warfare and you hear guns, go towards the guns. And that's quite a good heuristic for how to operate a big army that's in the 19th century, 18th century, and like doesn't have radio communication or whatever. That's a good way of making sure that everyone is following a simple rule that will help get the outcome. And look, similarly, if in our organizations, it's like, don't keep any rule that ruins a user journey, or don't never prioritize accounting over accounting over collaboration. Even then, there'll be an example where that's wrong, or whatever those things are. But that's what we get to experiment with.
Yeah, but to that point, I mean, that's the thing about heuristics, is there are always examples where they're wrong, right? They're not laws, they're patterns that generally hold to be true, and that there's value in us treating as if they are generally true. And I think that, so one of the best examples of that in business that we fail on all the time is the understanding of customer. Who is our customer? What do they care about? And as a general heuristic, do what is best for the customer is almost always going to be a good litmus test, let's say, for whether I should or should not do something as an individual employee anywhere in the company. And the problem often is that as organizations, we actually introduce and compartmentalize things such that way of thinking is not only not encouraged, is actively discouraged. And so you actually need to address and be upfront about that heuristic and talk about the fact that you should treat it as true, even if it's not always easy, even if it doesn't always make sense, right? And even though there might actually be exceptions, you should still treat the heuristic as if it's true, because that will bring you to success more often than just not considering it as an option or treating it as one among many options, right? If you have to go through 10 modes of thinking for every decision you make and figure out, right, do I want to do it for this reason or this reason or this reason or this reason, then you'll never make good decisions. Whereas if you say, right, in all cases, my first decision is whether I do this or not is defined by, is this going to be a better result for the customer or not? That is going to be a massive improvement in the general functioning of that entire organization if all of the individuals within it are acting aligned with that heuristic, which is, again, that antelope or starling phenomenon of, because we know that everyone else is doing it, we can actually make a lot of really difficult decisions a lot easier because we can trust that we're all kind of trying to do the same thing.
That feels like quite a good place to start to draw us to an end. Michael, where can people find out more about you and your work?
So LinkedIn is my main thing. I spend a lot of time there, and also dysfunctionmapping.com if you want to learn a little bit about what I do. Please feel free to just reach out. Like as you can tell from this today, I do like just having interesting chats with people, so I'm always happy to talk about helping to solve problems.
Brilliant. One thing I've been trying to do on this podcast is ask my guests for some feedback about the podcast as an experience as a guest. what was something that was easy or good for you? What was something that you would, that wasn't as easy and you would advise me to think about for next time?
Yeah, so I liked the general flow of the conversation in the sense of, I like to just have interesting conversations. So I like that we didn't shy away from stuff that we weren't experts on, just because I think we still gained some useful insight. I certainly gained some useful insights from it. I don't know if everyone else would. I guess the improvement thing would potentially be maybe having a couple of structured points to dive into some specific things that are our area of expertise, because I wonder, like, I certainly know we talked about some stuff that's aligned to your area of expertise. I maybe didn't do that as much, and I worry that probably just makes me come across like an idiot that only talks about stuff that I don't understand, but that's fine. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's the because we were trying like a more free-flowing, like, let's just see what comes up thing, but I think that then gravitated towards me being like, and here's the thing that's on my agenda a bit more. Next time I have you back on, we'll get that list of things and we'll make it a more Michael Lloyd centered.
It doesn't need to be a list. Like I say, I enjoyed the conversation, which is my primary reason for being here. Whether or not anyone else learns anything from it is secondary.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, appreciate it, mate. It was good to see you.
Yeah, nice.